You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 21st of October 2024 on Monocle Radio.
It's 6 a.m. in Dunedin, 2000 in Jerusalem, 1800 here in London and 1300 in Washington, D.C. That's the time on Monocle Radio, brought to you by Chanel Watches. 2 weeks out, the contenders for the US presidency hunt down undecided voters. But who, at this point, the heck are they? US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken makes another attempt to persuade Israel that it might have made its point. And the New Zealand airport seeking to reduce leave takings to a brisk handshake. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Julie Norman and Tessa Szyszkowicz will discuss today's big stories, and we'll meet Dutch philosopher Hanno Sauer, who will introduce his new treatise on good and evil. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller and I am joined today by Julie Norman, lecturer in politics and international relations at UCL and co-director of the UCL Centre on US Politics, and by Tessa Szyszkowicz, UK correspondent for Austrian weekly magazine Falter and the author of Echte Engländer, Britain and Brexit. Hello to you both.
Hello, good evening.
Helpfully, you have both recently been visiting places which are going to come up in our ensuing symposium. Julie, first of all, you have been to the Middle East.
Yes, I just got back from Jordan. I was there on a regional peace and security delegation, which sounds much more grand than it was. But pretty much just this idea that Jordan is often kind of taken for granted for its resilience, for its just kind of partnership with the UK, and Jordan just really trying to emphasize some of the challenges they're facing right now with all the crises in the region. So trying to hear from them and also do a little Wadi Rum adventure and camel ride and all the stuff you got to do when you're there.
And Jordan is famous for being the Middle Eastern country in which nothing ever happens, and I imagine they're pretty keen to keep it that way. Did you figure out what their secret was?
Yeah, I think it's all the good food. Honestly, no, it's
the food is fantastic.
It is fantastic, I've got to say. Just like sit back, eat, and relax. But
actually, the food in Syria and Iraq was always fantastic as well.
Good point. But no, they are sad point. But no, they are feeling the strain on all their borders, and it was important to go and hear that and also see what they might be able to do in the future.
And Tessa, by way of teeing up our first item nicely, you have just returned not merely from the United States, but from an actual swing state.
Yes, I went to Pennsylvania to look and talk to Trump voters in particular, because I feel that in Europe we always look and think like, why is about half of the country, as far as we know from the opinion polls, intending to vote for a convicted criminal. Mm-hmm. And so I went to talk to them up and down Pennsylvania, which is, with its 19 electors, of course, one of the most decisive of the swing states. And it was quite amazing to see who they bring out. All the big beasts of both parties are now running up and down the country, speaking in front of 50 people who are committed Republicans, but they will still want to convince them to bring their friends and mothers-in-laws also to the election on the 5th of November.
Well, we will be starting with exactly that in the United States, and we are 2 weeks out from Presidential Election Day Eve, and both opinion polls and betting markets have it closer than one might once have believed possible of a contest in which one of the two nominees is a convicted felon, a judged rapist, failed putschist, flagrant racist, rampaging misogynist and obvious nitwit. Even more bemusingly, the cohort of American voters who can't quite decide remains sufficiently substantial that both campaigns are expending considerable time and energy attempting to locate them and then persuade them. Julie, first of all, speaking as you often are called upon to do on this programme on behalf of the entirety of the American nation, how on earth, in this of all elections, is anybody still on the fence?
Yeah, I would say there's two main groups that fall into that undecided category, which in itself is very small. Like, we think it's probably less than 5% at this point. But less than 5% is going to make the difference. Oh, exactly. And it will make the difference in those battleground states, including Pennsylvania, probably most significantly. And so that's why getting these these voters is so important because it's pretty much split down the middle. And so these voters are going to make the difference. And I would say it's a lot of people who just don't follow politics that much in general and trying to make a play for them one way or the other. Or the other group within this are people who are normally voting Republican, are disillusioned with Trump, probably don't want to vote for him, but aren't sure they want to cast a ballot for Harris either. So you have, and different demographics are mixed up with that too. But I would say those are the two types of voters that we see as still undecided.
Tessa, in your adventures in Trump world, did you meet any undecided voters?
Very few, I have to say, because these are also the most difficult to get, probably, because you have to just walk around and ask randomly people. So when I went, for example, interesting was to speak to a few people from the Latino community who were traditionally voting more Democrat and now recently have been targeted heavily by the Republicans to get them to vote for them. And I understood a little bit better how second generation, U.S. citizens from Puerto Rico, but also from other Latin American countries, say we have Christian values and so we want someone who is more conservative. The party fits better to us, the Republican Party. And when you say but Donald Trump is not exactly sort of a classic conservative with Christian values, at least not ones that he adheres to. But they were saying that it's still for them an easier vote. And so that was quite interesting to see. But then, of course, I also went to the Amish country, to the people who are being told, basically, or sort of their beliefs say to them that they shouldn't go and vote in worldly things like elections for the U.S. president. But I think about 10% are going to vote, and they also lean towards the more conservative world view, because it's relatively easy to tell them that the Democratic Party is trying to set up a transgender woke world of people where you can't distinguish between men and women. And because they're so isolated, they might actually believe that.
I want to look at each of the campaigns in turn, and I'll ask you, Julie, to assess, if you will, Vice President Harris's, because for the third US presidential election running, we are looking at the Democratic candidate and wondering, how is this even close?
Exactly. And I would say one thing to note is on popular vote, she is polling pretty consistently ahead. And so some of this is really the electoral vote, but it's still way too close for Democrats' comfort and for her comfort. And I would say a lot of this is for some of the reasons that Tessa was just mentioning, and also just the fact that the U.S. is still at the end of the day mostly evenly split between Republicans and Democrats. And then you just have, again, these certain issues that nudge it one way or the other. So even when there's a candidate like Trump on the ballot, a lot of people are still saying, look, at the end of the day, I'm a conservative. I'm just going to vote with the party. And so we still see that dynamic falling out the same, even with someone like Trump on the ballot.
And if we look at Trump's campaign, which you have recently seen up close, Tessa, he has pretended to work in a McDonald's, which is possibly... which is incredible, really, when you think about it, that there is not actually one private corporation in the United States that would employ him, even at the level of a French fry dispenser. He has also been attempting to engage crowds in conversation about the dimensions of Arnold Palmer's appendage. Who do we think this is reaching?
Well, on social media, this McDonald's clips could actually reach quite a lot of people. And especially if you have a fan in there who says oh yeah, save us from becoming Brazil, my home country. Blah, blah, blah. This works, I think, with it goes pretty far on social media, these things. I mean, it's astonishing always to see that. But if you think that Barack Obama has to come out to convince young black men to vote for Kamala Harris, and you think... are they really so against having a female president that they would vote for a guy who is actually really not said anything that could actually help them in their lives? And it seems that these are the guys, for example, who are undecided if they should even go to vote at all.
Well, I just wanted to jump in on the McDonald's thing. I think that was a coup on Trump's part. I mean, that was extremely good politics for them to get those photo ops of him doing the French fries, and especially because Harris had worked at McDonald's and has talked about that in her stump speech. But that's become kind of a point that's not like proven and that kind of thing. And so for him to kind of go for that photo op, to me that was kind of like a scoop against her campaign, and one that they should have known to leverage. And this idea of black men, I think, is an interesting one, and one that Obama got some flack for saying those comments. And I do think, I mean, this is a demographic that has changed the vote a lot, but it's, as you've noted before, there's economic concerns, there's social concerns, there's a lot of things going into it, including gender, but I think not only gender, and we just don't really know what's driving that shift in that vote.
Well, in my experience in this last week, it comes down to economics a lot, and to people saying he just puts more money in my pocket. And it's quite concerning if you think
Which also isn't true, given that the American economy on Biden's watch has been on an absolute tear.
But it's, even the inflation is coming down, not only in America, also here. But it's sort of the question for people is, we don't want to wait until also the prices come down and we can't afford our lives a lot. And it's very sort of, superficial and populist and giving into the campaign that Elon Musk is sort of helping with his funny kind of stunts. But it's quite shocking to me how superficial, how polarized the whole sort of campaign feels if you're on the ground there, even more than from afar.
Just finally on this, Julian, on the subject of Elon Musk's intervention, do we think that the Department of Justice is being possibly somewhat tactfully tardy in not hauling him in for a word about his wheeze of, I'm going to go ahead and call it, attempting to bribe voters, which isn't really entirely legal?
Yeah, I mean, it's very clearly not legal to pay people for voter registration, and so I don't think this is going to hold up. I think because he is such an influential person, they are kind of handling him with kid gloves. But I don't think this is going to pass muster. But it's a very good stunt, so to speak. And if anything, I think putting it out there, Trump being able to point the finger at the deep state, at DOJ, and saying, look, they're shutting this down, is almost exactly what they want.
But wouldn't it make more sense to do something about it now rather than 2 weeks from now when it's too late?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, I think their foot dragging on this is I'm not sure where that is coming from, and they need to do something.
Well, meanwhile, moving seamlessly along, the incumbent administration has a little over 2 months to figure out how not to hand off a Middle East war to their successors. To that end, US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken is heading to the vicinity for the 11th time in the last year or so. He will meet Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Jerusalem tomorrow before pushing on to other capitals in the region. The idea/forlorn hope appears to be that the demise of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar, following the killing or incapacitation of a hefty proportion of the high command of Hezbollah, might be an opportunity for pause. Tessa, first of all, how do we like Anthony Blinken's chances of getting Netanyahu to call it all off?
Well, I mean, Julie is more the expert on this than me, but I think that Benjamin Netanyahu will have certain hopes that Kamala Harris does not come into the White House. So having a ceasefire and a celebration in the White House or around the White House with Kamala Harris and Joe Biden celebrating that they brought a ceasefire upon the Middle East is not in his interest. So the chances are very slim already for this reason. But then, of course, Netanyahu himself, since the death of Sinwar, where everyone for a brief moment thought like maybe this could lead to a kind of pause in fighting or at least serious negotiations about it, we have seen the bombing of not only of refugee camps in the north of Gaza, but also of banks affiliated with Hezbollah in Beirut. And you think, who's even determining anymore what you can bomb? I mean, you just say like, okay, this is a bank that is affiliated with Hezbollah, and that's enough to declare it a terrorist target, and that you can bomb in the middle of the night. So we are at the moment in a situation where these war atrocities are they have so left the room of any kind of international law framework, even in crisis situations and in war, that I am unfortunately not very optimistic that there is a ceasefire coming up soon.
Julie, there were those, myself included, who wondered/supposed that the probably inevitable death of Yahya Sinwar might be the cue to say, OK, we've got him, we declare victory, we've made our point, etc. Netanyahu insists that that isn't going to happen. Is it just, as Tessa suggests, that he's not interested in giving the Democrats a gift just in time for the election, or does he actually think this is Israel's opportunity to completely clean house in terms of its proximate enemies?
Yeah, I mean, everything that we've heard and seen from Netanyahu suggests the latter. And again, this was a very clear off-ramp. This was a very clear moment to start winding this down if there was any inclination to do so. The fact that he not only didn't, but very vocally said he would not, I think is a very clear indication that Israel intends to continue this campaign in Gaza, in Lebanon, and most likely against Iran. With Gaza, I would say it's not just the U.S. elections, though obviously that's, playing into some of the calculations. But throughout all of this, obviously Netanyahu's own internal domestic political situation has driven a lot of his decision-making as well. And also, I would say, beyond Netanyahu, much of the Israeli security establishment right now does see merit in continuing to pound Gaza. And when you just have a military strategy, there are always going to be more targets. And there is just not any kind of political strategy for any kind of thing what happens after the war. And they're, I think, just continuing to push that as far as down the line as possible and to create new facts on the ground in the meantime.
Tessa, on the subject of Iran, do we think that part of this trip is possibly Blinken trying to talk Netanyahu out of clobbering Iran in an overly precipitate manner? Because we have, of course, not yet had Israel's presumed imminent retaliation for Iran's recent missile barrage in the direction, rather, of Israel.
Yes, that's correct. And I'm sure this is going on not only with Blinken, but everyone sitting on the Israelis not to attack Iran in another way that escalates again to another level. If you think that there was a drone sent to Netanyahu's residence in Caesarea on the weekend, I really wonder how this will continue, because we used to have this threat of rockets in both directions. By now we are drones. Drones you can send very simply underneath the Iron Dome, also underneath the protection that the Israelis have from these rockets, to attack civilians. People sitting on the beach or walking home can be attacked now by drones in a very terrifying way. So I think what Netanyahu seems to completely disregard is the danger to his own civilian population. Forget about the civilian population that he should also take care of in Gaza and in Lebanon at the moment, and in Iran, where when there's a big attack coming now, everyone will go more into the direction of escalation and less into an attempt to calm a situation that has been started a year ago with the proclaimed idea of taking out the leadership of Hamas. And now Netanyahu says he's sort of giving them a root treatment, which also is a totalitarian kind of idea that you can uproot something like everyone you just declare to be a terrorist.
Just finally on this one, Julie, Anthony Blinken is in that weird position that American grandees arrive at this point in a presidential term, which is that whatever happens in 2 weeks, he will probably be out of a job, or at least out of his present job, in a couple of months. It probably won't be the case that, well, certainly Donald Trump won't keep him on, and Kamala Harris probably won't. So is anybody listening to him at this point? I mean, I know he is the US Secretary of State, which is a reasonably important job, but how much influence does he still have? Yeah,
I would say they've definitely lost a lot. I mean, with that said, though, they will still be in that position through January, through the inauguration. And I think the one optimistic way of looking at this is after the election for Blinken, for Biden, at that point, there's nothing to lose. That's often the point where we see kind of grander gestures that wouldn't have been considered before. But just with this administration, we've had we have seen significantly shifts in rhetoric, but really not any willingness to put any weight behind that with the leverage of U.S. military aid. And I don't see that changing before the election.
Well, Australia, meanwhile, is presently hosting a rare visit by its monarch, a statement which sounds ridiculous until you stop to marvel at the sagacity of my fellow Australian citizens who have conjured a situation in which we have a head of state who barely ever bothers us and whose castles and carriages someone else pays for. Among those not persuaded by the wisdom of this settlement is Senator Lydia Thorpe of the state of Victoria, who heckled KC3 on his arrival at Parliament, jeering that this is not your land and you are not my king. Tessa, first of all, the first part of her statement, this is not your land, is debatable, certainly, although I don't think Prince Charles has ever asserted any claim over Australia's territory. The statement, you are not my king, whether you like it or not, is just inaccurate, isn't it? Is this any sort of way for a senator to behave, I'm asking you?
Well, as an Austrian, staunch sort of Democrat, I have to say that, of course, that's all a lovely and very juicy double whammy story to have to go against a monarch if you are sort of, you think that should be a republic, your country. But also, of course, this whole colonialist heritage debate that Australia is having. And I think it's quite a lively thing to do. You know, why not? I thought her words were sort of partly maybe a little bit rough. And a lot of people would say, like, that you don't behave like this in front of a monarch. But I think monarchs should also be confronted with some criticism. And I think King Charles can also take it somehow. I mean, you know, he has been through worse things than that.
He has, and he spent a lot of time in Australia. He knows what we're like. But Julie, nevertheless, is this not a bit rich coming from somebody who, in order to take the seat she occupies in the Senate, would have, and I quote, sworn that she does solemnly and sincerely affirm and declare that she will be faithful and bear true allegiance to King Charles III, his heirs and successors according to law?
We all have to say, I mean, even when I became a citizen, you have to say that, right? So it's like, I feel like a lot of people will take these oaths. But I just, seriously though, I mean, I feel like obviously this was a very successful...
Are you saying you didn't mean it when you said it?
I mean...
This is just treason. Treason.
No, I'm with you, KC3. But I mean, I will say she's gotten us talking about on this, you know, on the show. It's been on headlines across the world, and it's raised this question again of not only Australia but other countries as well. I lived in Canada before I moved here, and when I got there and saw like the Queen at that point on the money, I was just like, what is this? Like, it never even occurred to me that the monarchy like stretched that far. And so I do think many countries, especially after the Queen's death, are reckoning with this, and she's brought it to the fore.
I mean, her case, or her wider point, Tessa, is that there should be, because there isn't, a treaty between the Commonwealth of Australia and the indigenous inhabitants of that land or their descendants, which Senator Thorpe is one of. But is this the way to make that case? Because if there was to be a treaty, the king would have nothing to do with it. He would. I don't even think he signs our laws anymore. Someone's going to write in and tell me whether that's right or not, possibly within seconds. But he would not be involved in any such negotiations directly.
Yeah, but I think her case was more to sort of bring the case to a public that would then see it because she did it in front of a king. If she just talks about it in Parliament, people will probably say like, oh, she's again on her point. And But I wanted to ask you if you can pronounce all this as an Australian, if you can pronounce the tribes that she is from, because it says Gunai.
How do you spell this?
I can show you. Yeah, maybe you have a better
talk amongst yourselves. Gunai, Gunditjmara and Jabwurrung.
It's pretty serious, everything that I read about her today, and I think it's quite nice. The thing is with Charles, you know, he didn't only get into trouble with her, with Mrs. Thorpe, but also with an alpaca who sneezed on him. Did you see that?
I did not see that Charles had been sneezed on by an alpaca.
Canberra, he was sort of, he met an alpaca in the crowd who had a little crown that was sort of also a little bit mischievous because it was maybe trying to trick him into believing that he was a fellow king, and then it sneezed on him.
I mean, alpacas will do that. I mean, my own contention, Julie, and regular readers of the Monocle Minute, to which you can subscribe free, would have read this morning that I think that this visit by Charles has mostly stirred up a largely dead issue, which is the wisdom or not of retaining Australia's link to the Crown. I think it's not really a big part of the public discourse until this guy turns up and we all start wondering, what are we doing? But has none of this made you rethink the wisdom of the decision your people made in 1776?
I mean, I think the Americans are happy with it. Somehow I ended up back here and like swearing allegiance to a king. So I guess for me personally, it didn't quite like work out the way the founding fathers thought. But what can I say? But yeah, I will say the whole monarchy concept is very like, I don't know, it's kind of fascinating to an American. And I love the fact that Americans now love the British monarchy. Like, they love the monarchs better than the British love the monarchs. And it's like, Democrat, Republican, whatever, like, people follow, like, Will, Kate, whatever. Like, it's very fascinating how, like, that table has turned.
So, the American Revolution, clearly a mistake. Tessa, do you have any regrets re the unthroning of the Habsburgs circa 1919?
Well, you know what happened after the Habsburgs. So, we had a brief rub with democracy and then produced Adolf Hitler to go to Germany and prepare the ground for the Third Reich and then devastate the whole of Europe. So
this really has turned into a case for the monarchy, this episode, hasn't it?
But having said that, it's really one of the few things that Austrians, I think, don't grapple anymore. So that's really done and dusted. So the Habsburgs, you have a little bit of a romantic view maybe of people, but it's a lot about the Empress Sissi, who had a certain following as an independent and slightly crazy woman, which is nice. But, the political system, nah. And we have the European Union now, which is almost as interesting as having a large empire with lots of people fighting among each other.
And it's glamorous.
It's a little less glamorous, but a little bit more useful, maybe?
A little bit.
More democratic also.
Well, to New Zealand, Dunedin in particular, where citizens farewelling loved ones at the airport are going to have to be quick. Airport authorities seeking to forestall snarl-ups in the drop-off zone have put up a sign cautioning max hug time 3 minutes. A sub-slogan suggests, for fonder farewells, please use the car park, an admonishment that could cause more problems than it solves, even if the weather in the South Island is rarely encouraging. Julie, what do we think? First of all, I would point out, when you think about 3 minutes is quite a long time to hug somebody.
That is a crazy long hug.
That is a long hug.
That is like, something else has got to be going on by that point. I mean, even like, more than like 10 seconds. That is a crazy long hug. Mm-hmm. I mean, even like hugging a whole family in that time period, it would I think would be a stretch. But to me, I think the uproar around this is just hilarious, like the cuddle cap and whatnot. It was just like this airport was just like trying to be kind of cheeky, and now they're getting slammed for being inhumane and nanny state and whatnot.
Well, exactly. People on social media are getting angry about it, but then that's what people on social media do. What do you think, Tessa? Do you think possibly, in fact, they are being too generous in allowing 3 entire minutes? Should they just put up signs saying, look, a brisk handshake and get moving?
Just because I'm Austrian, I'm getting this question now. I think, actually, that I love the whole story about putting up these signs. It's so silly that I wonder, they probably is Dunedin has a very small airport or something, that they even have that problem, because usually people rush out and run away, and you're actually quite happy if you see.
I thought Dunedin was the kind of place where people still point at aeroplanes. I wasn't aware there was an airport.
I mean, that's really, really the funny thing about it. And then the CEO of the airport saying that there's a study that a 20-second hug is long enough to release oxytocin. Mm-hmm. So that's the love hormone for anyone who doesn't know that by now. And that sounds
This is Julie's point. 20 seconds is plenty of time.
Right.
Yeah, in 3 minutes you can have a big snug. And I think it's all lovely, and they shouldn't put up these signs. They should take them down. But on the other hand, I think they are the first airport in the world. Or did you find any other evidence of any of this having ever happened anywhere else?
I have not, but I did. There is a wider point here, which intentionally or otherwise Dunedin Airport is addressing, which, and as I'm sure we all do, I am somebody who has spent far, far too much of their lives in airports, and they do weird things to people. People who are normally, I'm sure, reasonably switched on alert citizens turn into absolute zombies in airports. People sort of wander aimlessly around like grazing goats. They don't move. They get in the way, and I think it's because everything about the air travel experience is conditioned to, and not without reason, to make you kind kind of compliant and peaceable and not sort of be disruptive, that people just don't, they just sort of, I don't know whether to issue small numbers of airport security with cattle prods to sort of budge inefficient people along, but it is a thing.
Well, I will say, when I'm on planes, I'm like very emotional, and apparently this is like a thing. Like if I watch a movie, like I was like inconsolable during Mamma Mia 2. It was like ridiculous.
I would have been inconsolable if I'd been watching Mamma Mia 2 as well, but possibly for different reasons.
It's the air pressure that makes you more sort of teary and all this, but I'm definitely now booking a flight to Dunedin because I haven't been to New Zealand. I always wanted to go, and I want to use my 3 minutes of time to hug anyone who wants to come and pick me up.
Dunedin, and I am going to give Dunedin its due credit for this, was the heartland of New Zealand's fabulous indie rock scene of the late 1980s to early 1990s. The Chills, featuring the late great Martin Phillips, several times a guest in this studio, hailed from Dunedin, as did the Bats, the Clean, Straight Jacket Fits, I think, the Verlaine certainly, all of whose records I recommend heartily to our listeners. On that thought, Tessa Szyszkowicz, Julie Norman, thank you both for joining us. And finally, on today's show, looking back on our cave-dwelling, tree-climbing, club-wielding ancestors, it is easy to assert the superiority of modern civilization. On the other hand, spending a few minutes perusing the news could easily dispel your confidence on that front. We appear to be just as prone to spatting, spitting, hitting and killing each other now as ever, just with better weaponry and bureaucratic niceties. The Dutch philosopher Hanno Sauer has taken it upon himself to probe the subject of human morals and its progress in his new book, The Invention of Good and Evil, A World History of Morality. Monocle's Gunnar Grunlid spoke to Sauer earlier and began by asking him to explain what his definition of morality even is.
Really, the whole book is me explaining what morality is all about. Like, I'm not going in offering a neat and tidy definition because I think that can't really be done. Morality is sort of like on normative infrastructure, the norms and values and institutions that we have built to organize how we live together. But it's something that has a history, so it's hard to like put it into one tidy definition. And the whole book is really explaining what that thing morality is.
And just sort of starting off early on in the book, it seems like one of the features that sort of set this whole story off is simply humanity's ability to cooperate and its unique ability to do that to a stronger degree than any other animal species. But within that, you point out this us versus them dynamic that then really stays throughout the whole book and is still very much alive today. Where does that come from, and what does it mean for the way that we act morally in the world?
When we look at the news today, we see how deeply entrenched a kind of groupthink seems to be in our psychology. It's very easily activated, right? You just need to point at whatever group you want to scapegoat, whatever group you want to blame your social problems on. And you can just do that and people immediately recognize, yeah, those are the bad guys. And it really works very smoothly psychologically. And probably that is because we are cooperative beings and because of the way that cooperation evolved in the human species. So really what happened is that human beings face this pressure to collaborate, and collaboration is always somewhat costly for each and every individual. So that creates this challenge to explain how the emergence of cooperation was possible in the first place, how cooperation could even get off the ground as a feature of our psychology. And the only way it could is for our dispositions to cooperate to remain somewhat restricted. Remain somewhat restricted to people that are close to us genetically, relatives, for instance, that are close to us in our group so they can reciprocate a favor that I gave them today, for instance. But any way that exists for getting cooperation off the ground can't be sort of unconditionally given to everyone, but it must be restricted to a particular relatively narrow kind of group. And that explains why a kind of us-them thinking is so deeply ingrained in our minds.
And another thing that you investigate quite heavily in the book is this idea of moral progress. Would you say that we are, or is it more like hundreds of thousands of years ago we were hitting each other with fists and sticks? Now we're just hitting each other with more sophisticated, technologically advanced versions of those sticks?
Yeah, so the idea that society or humanity as a whole progresses towards a state of ever greater moral improvement was very fashionable in the Enlightenment, for instance, 200 years ago, 250 years ago. That was kind of the vibe that was around. If we get rid of superstition and unjustified authority and oppression and so on, and use science and technology and reasoning to figure out how to live together, everything's going to keep improving. Now, that has become very, very unfashionable or implausible, largely due to the 20th century, right? So the catastrophes in the 20th century with world wars and genocide have kind of laid waste to that idea that morality progresses automatically. And I think that's correct. That's genuine insight, that there are no guarantees that humanity will improve. Nevertheless, I try to sort of develop an updated understanding of that claim, according to which there are forces that push society in a direction of improvement, but there are no guarantees. These forces can be undermined, they can be sabotaged, they can be weakened, they can just sort of be derailed by accident or by problematic social movements and so on and so on. Now, what we are facing right now in the present day is basically another iteration of that cycle, where we have built institutions that allow us to cooperate globally. That means that we create problems that are of a global nature: pandemics, nuclear war, AI regulation, climate change, and so on and so on. All the interesting problems that are all over the news, they're all global problems, right? They can't be dealt with at a local level. They can't be dealt with at a national level. So we are witnessing right now another transitional phase where we need to figure out how to scale up our cooperative structures even more to deal with the problems that we have created for ourselves. In principle, that isn't new. All societies undergo that dynamic of growth, which makes their problems grow, which creates a need for their solutions to grow. And we are about to find out whether or not we manage to do that.
At one point in the book, I think it's near the end, you say, we don't actually disagree with each other, we just hate each other. And that's due to different forces that sort of separate us into us and them. Do you have a sense of a way that can be overcome in this current global situation where there's so many groups and ostensibly on the surface, it seems like we're so opposed to each other? How can we actually start to recognize those universal values so that we can work together better?
Yeah, so this line that we aren't actually disagreeing that much, we just hate each other, is supposed to be one step towards that end. What I mean by that is the way that moral universalism is underappreciated. I think polarization is overestimated and overstated. People really think that the other tribe, so to speak, whoever that is, usually a political tribe or a social subgroup or subculture, and we can just never reconcile ourselves to their ideas or their values, and we're just fundamentally opposed to each other. And I think that's not true. Much of what we perceive to be polarization and social division is just about relatively superficial identities, like I favor this club, you favor this club. But once we realize that, we can see that the dividing lines between this or that tribe aren't actually that deep. And once we realize that it's largely based on relatively superficial and shallow group identities, we have made at least one step towards overcoming these divisions. And often that perception of polarization and irreconcilable tribes is just created by social media, right, where the most extreme voices are the loudest, and we just don't hear about all the people that could talk to each other fruitfully in the middle.
That was Hannah Sauer, the philosopher, talking about his new book, The Invention of Good and Evil, A World History of Morality, to Monocle's Gunnar Grunlid. And that is all for this edition of The Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Julie Norman and Tessa Shishkovitz. Today's show was produced by Monica Lillis and researched by Gunnar Grunlid and Sana Jumani. Our sound engineer was Sarah Nichol. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.